All right, this has the potential to be a little bit of a long video. So right at the front, I'm going to give you the basic functionality of dynamic symmetry, aka your arbitrary Gizmo work plane. So hit comma on your keyboard, go into tool, double click the dog. I'm going to switch this out to matte cap gray, comma on your keyboard to turn off lightbox, drag it on your canvas, go into edit mode, make polymesh 3D. Let's go ahead and turn off perspective just so we can kind of see orthographically what we're talking about. So by default, I'm sculpting in ZBrush. It's not symmetrical. However, if I go into my transform menu and I tap, well, if I tap X on my keyboard, you'll see it's going to activate symmetry in your transform menu. So just tap X on your keyboard. That'll turn on X symmetry. And now you're sculpting symmetrically. Of course, we're across the world axis now. So if I was to go in here and say, okay, hit W to go into Gizmo so I can move this dog over. And you know what? Let's rotate this in space and just kind of move it over here. Again, I have X symmetry turned on, but I'm not sculpting symmetrically, so I'm going to turn on local symmetry. Versions of ZBrush 2022 and before, the fact that my dog is just, you know, kind of pointed down in space, it would break symmetry. However, in ZBrush 2023 and beyond, you can now sculpt symmetrically on any object, no matter how it's oriented, translated, scaled in space. You can now sculpt symmetrically on this object, and it's being driven by this gizmo. So because the gizmo says this is the front of my dog and I'm in the middle of the dog, that's giving me a plane in space that allows me to sculpt symmetrically. So if I hit Control D a couple times to subdivide this up, you can see no matter where I end up moving this in space, it's always going to maintain that symmetry. Another thing they've introduced, if I hit W on my keyboard, if you hold down Shift and tap any of these arrows, that will take you to, it's going to take your camera and make it perpendicular to the axis you touched. So for example, if I hold down Shift and touch the Z direction, it's going to take me straight forward on the Z axis and look directly at my object. If I hold down Shift and touch the Y axis, it's going to take me straight to the top. Then look right down the barrel of that Y axis from my gizmo. So that's it. That's the basics of the new dynamic symmetry, again, being controlled by your gizmo. So if you just need to hop in and hop out, that's basically all you need to know. If you want to stick around for the next 20 minutes, we're going to be going a refresher on ZBrush symmetry, gizmo functionality, and then ways to refine symmetry on any given object in your scene, some tips and tricks and all the usual stuff. But feel free to head out if that's all you needed. And for anybody that's left, let's start over. So I'm going to go in here to my subtool, delete this out of our scene, and we'll start fresh. So I'm going to go into my tool palette. We'll grab a cube. Let's turn off L.Sym. Let's hit Make Polymesh 3D. And now we have a cube in our scene. Go ahead and turn on your floor because we're going to talk about axes in ZBrush first. So if I go down to the bottom here, you're going to see I have a blue line, a red line, and a green floor. Essentially, we can actually go to our floor and turn on X, Y, and Z. These are all the axes of our world. The X-axis is usually red. Blue is Z, and then Y is green, Y is up and down. So that's why they have the Y on by default. It makes a nice floor plane in the Y direction. Now, if I go in here to draw, you can actually see that green line. So if I take this grid size and crank it up, you'll see that starts growing those lines. And that middle point in space is our world axis. So where X, Y, and Z are 0, that is a point in our huge 3D world where it's 0, 0, 0. That's your world axis, and you can be symmetrical across that world axis. So we talked about this before. Let's double click our divider to open this up. If you don't have this open, we'll kill this brush just by clicking that white dot. We'll go in here to transform and we'll grab that white dot, pull it over here, because this is where our symmetry settings are. And local symmetry, which is also over here on the right. Your right side buttons might be a little different than mine, but somewhere over here is an L.Sym button. It's the same one that's over here in your transform menu. So, like I was saying before when we were playing with the dog, if I hit X on my keyboard, that activates symmetry. And by default, it activates symmetry in the X direction. You can choose any symmetrical axis that you'd like and even turn on radial, but by default, it's in the X direction. Usually because, you know, you might be sculpting ahead. So let's go over here to geometry and hit divide a couple times, or if you hover over this, you'll see Control D is the hotkey. And now we have a subdivided square. So hit Q to go into draw mode, or hit the draw button up here. And then if we have our standard brush selected, we can hold down Alt and we'll carve in some eyeballs. And then we'll let go of Alt and we'll do a mouth, or the opposite. Bulge some eyeballs, hold down Alt to carve in a mouth. Now, because we have Activate Symmetry turned on and the X-axis, we're able to sculpt symmetrically in the world axis. And a lot of the time, that's all you really need to do. Like I mentioned before, if we undo that, if we turn off X and turn on Z, now you see our cursor is front and back, and you can do both at the same time. So we can do X and Z. So now if we carve in a face here, you're going to see it's happening on the front and back of the object. So let's go back to X symmetry here. So there's a caveat to this. If I scoot this over to the right, you're going to see my object moves over to the right. But when I hit Q on my keyboard, you're going to see, oh, I'm still symmetrical across the world axis. You know, right about here is the middle of my world, but my object scooted over, so now I can't sculpt symmetrically. Now you could undo that. Incidentally, you could also go down here to geometry position and zero out that position if you'd like. And now you're in world symmetry, and that's totally valid. If you just want to move your object to world axis 0 and turn on symmetry and move it, make sure it's pointed straight forward, go for it. However, you can move it over, and in ZBrush 2022 even, you could turn on L.Sym and this would work. You could actually turn on local symmetry, and what that would do is look at the bounding box of your object, and as long as you were facing toward an axis, you know, Z forward or to the left, this would work for you. However, where it would fall apart is if you were to arbitrarily, you know, move, scale, rotate, translate this object in space. In ZBrush 2022 and before, if you had L.Sym turned on, it would still not do what you would want it to do. However, in ZBrush 2023 and beyond, with L.Sym turned on, I can now still sculpt symmetrically on my object in the axis I'm telling it to, which in this case is across the x-axis. And how that's being controlled is by this gizmo. So it's no longer looking at the world axis, it's looking at this gizmo and saying, oh, this is Z forward, Y is up, X is side to side. And it's important to differentiate between those two because, you know, if you have your object here and then you rotate your object like this, and if you hit Q to go back into draw mode, you know, you may look at this object and go, oh, here's the front of the object, or else even rotate it this way. So here's, I'm assuming, you know, this is the front of my object. I open up ZBrush and this is the front of my object, right? So I'm going to activate symmetry. Wait, what? Now it's on the left, like, is this the left and right of this object? It's hard to tell. Well, if you hit W, you will see, yes, that is the left and right of your object. That is your x-axis because we rotated it so that Z is up here. So that's the face of our object. If this was Z forward on the local axis of this object, and then Y is up here, even though compared to the world, this is kind of the Y direction, right? So again, it's arbitrary based on your gizmo. So let's go ahead and undo that back to where we were just kind of had a square here. And when we created this primitive, or any primitive that we create, it inherits the world axis. So when I created this cube, you're going to see by default it puts the gizmo right in the middle of the bounding box of this object, and it goes Z forward, Y up, X left to right, just like the world axis. Now I hit Q and I start drawing, we're activating symmetry in the x-axis, we're good to go. Now let's talk about radial symmetry. So if I go over here and I turn on the Y direction, so that's up and down, and I turn on radial symmetry, that's going to basically put 8, however many numbers we have here, so 8 cursors in a circle radially around a pivot point in the Y direction, and in this case it's up and down, again based on our gizmo because we have L.Sym turned on. If you turn L.Sym off and it's back at 0, it'll do the exact same thing. So with L.Sym turned off, radial count at 100, Y direction, again world Y up, we can sculpt no problem in the Y direction. Or we can tell it, hey, Z direction, turn off Y, and now we can sculpt forward in the Z direction. However, like I mentioned before, I can go over here and I can move, scale, and rotate this object, turn on L.Sym, and now it's on the local axis. So now when Z is down here, this is the Z direction, I can change it to the Y direction, and I'm right here. Now one thing you couldn't do in the world axis without moving the object anyway, is be able to control where this pivot is. So if I say, you know what, let's turn on the x-axis here, and I'm sculpting, and again, it's converging at a single point. And guess what? Where that single point is wherever my gizmo pivot is. That tells it where the center of my radial symmetry is. So if I move this forward, it's going to move my whole object. So a little bit of gizmo functionality. If I tap Alt on my keyboard, you'll see it unlocks that little lock right there. So if it's locked and I don't have Alt held down, it's going to move my object. If I hold down Alt, it's going to unlock it, and now I'm moving the pivot. So if I move this forward, now these are going to converge on that point in space because the gizmo's telling it that's the new object pivot. So now I can go through here and sculpt around that new pivot. Now if I hit Control Z and hit W, you're going to see it'll actually Control Z. If I hold down Alt and move this forward and hit Control Z, it'll undo your Gizmo changes as well. So let's undo to get rid of all that sculpting on here. And again, if we were activating symmetry in the Z direction with our radial count and hit Q, okay, we're sculpting the Z direction. Well, remember, if you hold down Alt and then rotate this, you can see it's going to come up with some really small numbers. Hold down Shift to snap it to increments. So I'm going to hold down Alt to unlock my gizmo, hold down Shift to snap it to increments, and I'm going to go 90 degrees in this direction. So now I just changed what the front of my object is. Well, I say front. I just changed where the Z-axis of my object is, and generally speaking in ZBrush, that's the front. So now, even though I kept it on Activate Symmetry in the Z direction, this is now the Z direction. If I say, okay, give it to me in the X direction, well, that's going to be, oops, just the X direction. That's going to be left and right. However, that's all purely based on what direction that gizmo is facing. Now Y is up this direction. So you have a lot of power to be able to set, whatever axis. If I want to, I can again hold down Alt and then hold down Shift. I'm going to make my Z forward over here. Y, I'm going to make up and down like this. And now X is left to right. And this doesn't just work with, subdivision geometry or anything like that. You can absolutely go in here and say, hey, give me a Dynamesh. Dynamesh this object. Say no, you don't want to freeze subdivisions. Let's go ahead and say X symmetry with L.Sym turned on. So our gizmo, again, if I hit W, our gizmo is telling it where the center of my object is. It's putting a plane right here with the X and Y on the left and right hand side. And now with Dynamesh, I can go through here and I can sculpt in symmetry at an arbitrary angle with this object. In fact, I can go in here to BI brush insert. Oh, you know what? Let's do hit B on your keyboard and then C. We'll do brush curve snap. We can go through here with curve brushes symmetrically. We can go through here. Let's grab our Damien standard brush. We can do our whole, mark one time and then mark another time. Go in here to stroke, interpolate, and again, it's doing it across the X-axis locally on this arbitrarily positioned object. If we go over here to geometry, modify topology, there's a mirror and weld in here. So if we wanted this face again, which is in the Z direction, we want it on the back of our object. All we got to do is tell it, hey, modify topology, mirror and weld in the Z direction. It's going to look at the gizmo and say, okay, mirror and weld. There's our Z direction. Halfway across the object is going to mirror it in that Z direction. So from positive Z to negative Z, and there we go. Now we got the face on both sides. Of course, if I want to sculpt in that direction, I need to go over here and activate symmetry in the X and the Z. So again, X left to right, and then Z forward to back. And kind of the opposite of that is delete by symmetry. So we go in here and say delete by symmetry. It'll delete the half in the X direction or again in the Z direction if you'd like. So now let's talk about ways to find symmetry. And to do this, we'll go back to the dog. Let's hit the comma key, tool, double click the dog Z tool. Let's go ahead and hit the comma key to get out of there. So again, we'll hit tap X to go into X symmetry here. We have L.Sym still turned on, so it's looking at the local axis of the dog. So one more time, we'll move, scale, and rotate this off into space. We'll go ahead and turn our floor off. I think we have a pretty good handle on world axes by now. And let's say we're sculpting on our dog in X symmetry. Everything's going fine. But then I hit W and then I Alt tap on this object. And that's actually a totally valid way to reset the pivot of your object, just by Alt tapping on an object. In the case of an organic object, though, it's not super helpful. If I wanted to be like, oh shoot, I need to refine the front of my object. If I go to the front and Alt tap here, it's not really pointing Z forward on this guy, right? It's kind of pointing out into space here. So Alt tapping on a hard surface object is fine. You can just Alt tap on a flat face and boom, you'll be pointing straight out from that plane. And that's actually what this is doing. I should explain that. Alt tapping on here is going to think of every single face on your object as having a rubber band sticking straight, not a rubber band, a spike sticking straight out of the object. That's your surface normal. So when you Alt tap on your object, it's going to find the surface normal of your object and point out straight from that. But I need to find the center of this object again. Well, what I could do, again, gizmos are undoable, so you can just undo back to where you were before, and now it's right back where it started. But let's say this was moved into space and you saved the file and brought it back in, and now it's just sitting out here. One thing you can do is you can go in here, So again, we have symmetry activated. You can click this Use Posable Symmetry. Just go ahead and click that button. That'll look at your object, and as long as your object geometry is symmetrical, it'll find the symmetry of your object. So it went right to the middle of my object. It is Z forward. Of course, you can hold down Alt, and you can rotate that in that axis if you want to modify the gizmo position a little bit. But now we have X symmetry back. So if I go through here and start sculpting, just using posable symmetry on a symmetrical object will immediately snap it there. We'll go ahead and hit delete posable symmetry. Let's say you don't have a symmetrical object, and in fact, later on I'll show you an example of that. And there's other ways to refine the center of your object here. One way is you can hold down Alt, and you can Alt and drag on your object. So here's the midline of my dog here. And when I Alt and drag, what it's doing, and kind of to illustrate this, so we have our gizmo turned on. And you see the hotkey for that is actually W, because that activates transpose/gizmo. And because this is on by default, Gizmo 3D, that's what shows up. If you hit Y on your keyboard, that brings up the transpose line. And this is a really good way to illustrate what that gizmo is doing under the hood. So when I Alt to unlock my gizmo, and then I click on a point with Alt held down, and then I drag, it's snapping to another point. So if you Alt tap on a point and then you just move your cursor to the point in front of it, it's basically doing this. It's snapping. So now if I hit Y on my keyboard, you'll see the gizmo actually inherits that. But just move that off. I just wanted to show you what it's doing. Just Alt, and then as I'm dragging around, you're seeing, oh, it's going to snap to that point. It'll even snap to this point over here if you want. But basically, for the center line, I just want to Alt and then drag and snap to that point in front of it. And now I've got the Z forward of my object. Of course, when I hold down Alt, it finds the surface normal and goes Z out. It's by design. If you want Z to actually be forward, you can hold down Alt, again, drag to that point, and then just hold down Alt and Shift, and we'll snap this, 90 degrees forward, and then, of course, we'll do 180 degrees in this direction. So now we're Z forward, Y up, X left to right. So now if I, again, activate symmetry by tapping X on my keyboard, and we go in here and sculpt, now we've found, again, the center of our object, and we're symmetrical again. Again, you can hold down Alt and move this gizmo in the middle of the object if you want to. Totally fine. Use posable symmetry if you'd like. There's some other options. So in the ZModeler brush, again, if your gizmo is just in middle of nowhere, go into your ZModeler brush. So BZM brings up your ZModeler brush, or if you just hit B on your keyboard, there it is, somewhere down here. And now if I hover over a face, and this is just basic ZModeler, and you're also going to see, because my object, or my gizmo's way out here, there's the Z axis plane. So when I'm sculpting symmetrically in the X axis, it's on the dog and then way out in the middle of nowhere. I'm going to tap X on my keyboard just to turn that off temporarily. Hit Q so we can go use our ZModeler brush. And again, here's the middle of my dog, this line down the back of the tail. So with my ZModeler brush, again, basic ZModeler functionality, if I hover over a point and hold down spacebar with this brush, it gives me point actions. Let's change that to set symmetry. Hover over an edge, that gives me edge actions. I'm going to set this to set symmetry. Hover over a face, hold down spacebar, set this to set symmetry. So now you can set symmetry based on any component that you'd like. So for example, point symmetry, if you just hover over a face, is going to tell you, hey, set symmetry, click the first point. So we'll go ahead and click on that point, click the second point, there you go. And that will put that gizmo and kind of point it straight forward. Didn't do a great job in this particular case. Try it on other objects, it might work a little bit better. Instead, let's hit Q and let's use edge action. So again, this is our center line right here. So I'm going to go over 2 maybe, and I'm going to say symmetry, click first edge, no problem. I'm going to click that one. Again, there's our center line. I'm going to skip that one, and then I'm going to click this one, and there we go. Again, we have the X-axis pointing in the right direction, but this left and right isn't really working that well. Let's try face actions here. So what I'm going to do is, again, in my ZModeler brush, I'm going to click this poly, skip 4 from the center line, click this poly, and there we go. So now between those 2 polygons, it found the center of my object and gave me an axis, which, it's my Z-axis. It's actually pointing backwards. It's just totally fine. It's still symmetrical in the X direction, left to right. If you want to fix it, you can hold down Alt and then point this to the front, and then hold down Alt and Shift, and we'll do 180 degrees for that. And now again, we have, turn X symmetry back on. We are now symmetrical on this object here. So now I've got all sorts of symmetrical objects just kind of placed on this guy. So this is going to come in real handy as that arbitrary Gizmo work plane. First though, let's talk about stager. So if I alt tap on this little skull in between his legs here, this is symmetrical across that world axis. So I can work symmetrically. Again, I don't have to be moved or rotated anywhere. I can just work symmetrically on the world axis. And in fact, let's go down here to geometry, stager, and we're going to set this as our home stage. And then I'm going to hit W. We're going to turn off X symmetry by tapping X on our keyboard, and we'll just go ahead and kind of stick this skull about where it should be. And I can set that as the target stage. And then there's this switch stage here. So if I hit switch stage, and of course you can assign a hotkey to that. I can have X symmetry turned on, and we'll turn off L.Sym. So we can have X symmetry turned on here. With our Damien standard brush, we can start, sculpting again symmetrically in the world axis with L.Sym turned off. I can hit targets. I can hit switch stage. That'll push it over here. And in fact, even in the target stage, if I turn on L.Sym, I can go over here and sculpt symmetrically because the gizmo is now over there and it's on L.Sym. However, when I hit switch stage, you're going to see the gizmo stays there. So that's why we have to turn off L.Sym so we can sculpt symmetrically in the world axis. However, you can even use that to your advantage. Let's say your gizmo got messed up, but you still have a home stage. We'll turn off X symmetry. I'm going to go to Unmesh Mesh Center, and then I'm going to hit this Reset Orientation. Because we were originally sculpting in the world axis, when we reset our orientation to the world axis, which is what this does, that's fine because our world axis actually matches our object axis. However, of course, now when we hit switch stage, the gizmo won't follow it, but that is a way to reset your axis if you do have a stager, if you do have a home stage for your stager. Alternatively, and I'm not going to do this because it's really going to, it's already a long video, it'll bloat it even more. I'm going to leave a link to the description to this video that's going to take you to the Nanomesh Symmetry instances. So you can actually have a Nanomesh plane that you can sculpt symmetrically with a plane that you put an instance on. It's a whole thing. You can go check those videos out if you'd want for this type of workflow. Anyway, I just wanted to bring those up just as more of a refresher or reminder than anything. However, I do have another instance over here that is going to be kind of difficult. So I have, again, this is an old file. If I hit W, it's going to solo mode. The gizmo isn't really related to the object. If I say go to Unmesh Mesh Center, it finds the middle of the bounding box of the object, but it's not really the middle of it. If I go in here, just to kind of prove that, if I go in here to Geometry Modify Topology and do a mirror and weld across the X-axis, you're going to see, well, number one, it actually did it across the world axis, so it's way over there. I need to turn on L.Sym because I want to work locally on this little skull over here. And again, it's twisted and turned arbitrarily in space. So again, local axis, I went to Unmesh Mesh Center, I do a mirror and weld across the X, and see how it kind of jumps? Well, not ideal. And you may be thinking, okay, well, we've already talked about, could you use posable symmetry? So go in here to X symmetry here and say, oh, use posable symmetry. Still doesn't work on this guy because, let's go ahead and, yeah, it'll even tell you, no symmetry points restored. So you can click this all day long, it's not going to do anything. Because if we look in here, it's an old Dynamesh, and I probably scooted it around a bunch, and you're going to see there is no actual midline for this object, which is kind of a bummer because if I go in here and hit W, and then if I want to do the old trick where I hold down Alt and then just kind of drag to another point, there is no midline point to drag on. So again, if I hold down Alt and Shift and make this 90 degrees, I can say, I don't know, mirror and weld, and it's pretty close, but not quite. I can't go into my ZModeler brush like we talked about, BZM, and like click on a face here and click on a face here. I mean, you can try it, and we'll say, mirror and weld, and again, it's pretty close. In this particular instance, probably what I would do is just very quickly go through here and be like, okay, where's the middle of my object? Hold down Alt, and then drag it, and then it'll say, hey, I want to be Z forward, so I'll just rotate this 90 degrees. I'm going to hold down Alt, and I'm going to rotate this a little bit. I'm just going to kind of go from all the angles of this head here, get it generally in the middle, and then just do a mirror and weld across the X-axis. Tweak that a little bit here. There we go. So just kind of manually putting it in place. Now when I do a mirror and weld, you'll see it just kind of changed slightly. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm going to my custom menu, mirror and weld, Geometry Modify Topology, mirror and weld, it's over here. But now that I have that, and again I'm Z forward, Y up, and X side to side, I can go into my standard brush. Again, I'm going to change my activate symmetry in the X direction. And now I have a symmetrical object that I can start sculpting on. Something to maybe consider, you can hit W on your keyboard and you can go in here to your gear icon and you can change this to something like a polycube. Now, of course, that's going to swap this geometry out. So what I could do is go in here, say duplicate this off. So I've just, again, symmetry is on there. The axis is where I want it. I can hit this little thing here. I can say, you know what, give me a polycube here. I'm going to scale this down. I go to solo mode here. Let's hold down shift and I'm going to turn off the eyeball for the skull. And then on my duplicate here underneath, I'm going to turn the eyeball on for those two. So now I have a cube. So I'm going to select the cube. So again, we turned our duplicated skull into a cube using this menu. And now this cube inherited the gizmo position and it made a cube that is now has faces pointing at all the axes that I need. So if this object ever gets weird again and I lose my midline, or I don't know, something goes crazy, I can always go back to, if I want to, I can say merge the skull down, W, Alt drag, and again hold down shift so that we're 90 degrees. I can control shift, tap on the head to isolate it. I can go down here to split, hidden, and now my skull is exactly where it should be. I can go in here to geometry, modify topology, mirror and weld, and it's perfect. So you can have objects, and if you're never going to see on the inside, if I hold down shift and turn this eyeball back on so everything turns back on, I'm never going to see underneath this skull, so I can just leave those merged if I want to. I can just merge this down, and while I'm working on the skull, I at least have a flat surface. So if I go through here and I Dynamesh this, and I'm sculpting, and I lose my axis of symmetry, I can just hold down Alt and tap, so at least I know where Z forward is, and I can try and re-inherit that Z forward direction. Now in this case, since they're Dynamesh together, it's a little bit more difficult than if it was the cube with a nice, easy geometry to kind of figure out. But anyway, that's just neither here nor there. If that's useful or something you want to kind of put in your back pocket, go for it. Use it if you need to. Now, one very last thing. So if I go through here, I'm just going to make a cube, make polymesh 3D. Let's go ahead and scale this down, hit W, and then scale it down in this direction. Then we'll go ahead and geometry, Dynamesh, just turn down blur, resolution 128 is fine. So we have a little Dynamesh cube in our scene. And again, we're going to rotate, scale, and move this thing so it's just at an arbitrary angle. And let's say I wanted to go through, and let's switch this color or this material out. So now if I hold down Control Shift, we can go in here and grab our knife curve. So if you remember the bison demo I did a ton of this type of work where I go through here and just slice pieces of this thing off to make interesting hard surface shapes. However, this thing is rotated arbitrarily in space, right? And I want to look directly down at this object. And again, that's where that new gizmo comes into play. Now, there was, if you hold down, if you go to BZM, there is, if you hover over a face, there is a set camera perpendicular to a face. Now, on a low-ish poly object, this is 41,000, so it's not that low, it'll work fine. However, if you're working on like a 10 million polygon object or an object with subdivisions, a lot of polygons, using the ZModeler, set the perpendicular might be a little difficult. However, remember, you can always hold down Shift. And then click that Z or whatever axis you want to cut in. In this case, the Z is what I want to. And that'll point that camera straight in the direction of that gizmo. So now when I'm using this knife curve, I can be confident in the fact that I'm looking straight down at this. So I'm not doing like, slightly off, so these are all looking straight down at this face or at these faces. So it's cutting straight back. If I tried to eyeball this into place, I'd probably be a little bit off. It's going to cut at a slight angle back. Some instances it's not a huge deal, but in other instances you may want to, again, have your camera perpendicular, and that's where that shift and then clicking that axis comes in handy. Or if you want to, do some detail work, again, or paint from your spotlight directly straight down onto something, again, just remember you can use that shift gizmo click to get there fast.